G'day, I'm Troy.
And I'm Brian.
And we're the hosts of I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist, an ex-evangelical podcast.
We used to be loyal members and leaders in Australian Christian megachurches, but we're not anymore.
I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist is an honest and hilarious peek behind the curtain at the weird, the worrying, and sometimes traumatic world of evangelicals and Pentecostals.
We share our stories, we interview prominent guests in the global ex-evangelical space, and provide a platform for others to tell their stories about their time in evangelicalism and their journey out.
Shortlisted at the recent Australian Podcast Awards, I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist gives you a unique global perspective into one of the fastest growing religions in the world from the people who actually lived it.
You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and iwasateenagefundamentalist.com.
This episode of Still Unbelievable is a replay of a conversation that Andrew and I had with Philip Goff and Brian Blaise. The original conversation is episode 3 of the Proscenium podcast. If you have not already listened to that, then this episode is a conversation where we invited philosopher Philip Goff to discuss Panpsychism and his book Galileo's Error, which I recommend. See links in the show notes. We invited Brian Blaise to join the conversation because we thought that Philip and Brian would have a conversation worth listening to. I think you'll find that we made a good call. Andrew and I are joined this time by two returning guests, both guests who we have featured on our other sister podcast, Still Unbelievable. First of all, we have Dr. Brian Blaise, who we featured on an episode. I can't even remember what it was that we were talking about, Brian, but I know we had a pleasurable chat and we promised that we'd have you back again. So welcome on to Proscenium, Brian.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And joining Brian again is somebody who we've had on before, is Professor Philip Goff. Welcome, Philip.
Hi, thanks for having me back.
Yes, thank you for having you both on. Now, both of you have also been guests of the podcast Unbelievable, and that I think is how we got in touch with you. Anyway, Philip, I think you've been on twice, and the most recent time was talking about your new book, Galileo's Error, which you told us about when we had you on first time round, and we promised that we would have you back to talk about that, and you very kindly provided us with copies of your book. So I would like to say to listeners, Andrew and I and Brian have all read your book. I'm enjoying your book. I've got it here open in front of me. And I want to say absolutely straightforward to our audience listeners, go out, buy a copy of this book. I don't care whether you agree with it or not, just buy it. It's a tremendous read. It's very accessible and it is a genuine pleasure. I don't mind admitting that in a previous life, it's a kind of book that I would have walked past on a bookshelf, but I am so glad that I didn't and that I've got a copy in front of me. Thank you so much, Philip, for sending it to me. If you're a fan of this podcast and you want to support this podcast, then the most practical thing you can do right now is go out and buy a copy of this book because it supports Philip and it says thank you to Philip for appearing to come on this. So that's my unpaid for plug for this book.
That's so kind. Thank you so much. That's very generous to say so.
It's also available on Audible. And
the US version, I'm not sure. I don't think the UK version has an audio version, but I think the US version does, the different publishers.
Oh, does that mean it's got odd pronunciation?
Actually, the US version is done by the star of Grease 2.
Yeah, it was done. It is
that's reason to buy it just for that.
Now, and so it doesn't have odd pronunciation. It sounded just right to me.
You would say that.
The other reason for buying
American and understand English.
This is something that I really wanted to slip in. Is the other reason for buying is it contains a very brief reference to my favourite time travel movie. So thank you for that, Philip. It was glorious to trip over that as I was reading through it. If you want to know what that is, buy the book and read it. It will end at that. So with that over with, welcome again, both of you. Philip, would you like to kick off? Tell us a little bit about what promoted the book. We're here to talk mostly about panpsychism and consciousness, and we'll keep the conversation quite narrow to that. So kick off with your thoughts on that, and Brian can respond, and we'll see where we go.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. So I guess the book is all about the problem of consciousness. which, I take to be roughly the view that the problem of how we bring together what we know about ourselves from the inside with what science tells us about the brain or matter more generally from the outside. So if you study brain science, you'll learn about action potentials and calcium chambers and neurotransmitters and overall a very complicated story of electrochemical signaling. That's one story about what's going on in your head. Another story is a story of feelings and experiences, emotions, what it's like to see red, what it's like to taste Marmite, our feelings and experiences that we're immediately aware of every second of waking life. So, on the face of it, these seem like two very different stories. There's, the quantitative story we get from neuroscience of the workings of the brain, and there's the qualitative, subjective reality of our conscious experience with colors and sounds and smells and tastes. And the puzzle is, how do these two stories fit together? So, one option is dualism, the idea that they're just two very different realms of reality. The conscious mind is non-physical outside of the workings of the body and the brain. That's one option. Another option, perhaps the most dominant one, is the materialist option, which is roughly the idea that we can explain consciousness in terms of the chemistry of the brain. And I guess most people agree that no one has even the beginnings of an explanation for how to do this. But it's a kind of promissory note that one day we'll get there. And I guess I find both of these views really problematic for different reasons. And so most of the book is discussing and raising the philosophical or scientific problems with both of these options before I eventually get to a middle way, panpsychism, which tries to hold both of these stories in place, but as two sides of the same coin, as two parts of the material universe. And it sounds, maybe we'll get into it a bit later, it initially sounds a bit of a wacky option. I mean, it's roughly the view that consciousness is everywhere, is a fundamental feature of matter. And it sounds a bit wacky to start off with, but the attraction of it is, I think, that it avoids the deep difficulties with these two more traditional, conventional options. On the one hand, dualism, that consciousness is non-physical, outside of the brain. And on the other hand, materialism, that consciousness can be accounted for in terms of the chemistry of the brain. It avoids the deep difficulties, I think, that face these more conventional options. Yeah, so that's roughly the story.
Thank you, Philip. Brian, do you want to jump on?
Yeah, sure. So now, as I was reading, I really enjoyed your book, Philip, though, and at the beginning, there seems to be a defense of philosophy for approaching problems like this. And I want to say, right up that I'm not a philosopher. So my background's in physics, and I do some exploration of brain modeling and things like that. And I agree also that the story of consciousness is not entirely understood. I mean, it's up there on the big problems and that we want to understand. Things like, how did life form on the planet originally? Those are the kind of mysterious problems right now, where there are perhaps few options sometimes. Sometimes there's too many options. We don't really know how to constrain the problem. And so, but it is useful to think of the three different approaches to consciousness. Dualism, which I think is perhaps the most common perspective among people who aren't scientists, because it's essentially the idea of a soul, and that your consciousness is somehow separate from your body. And that one, and I think Philip may agree, suffers from essentially the interaction problem. How do you propose something like a soul or some non-corporeal consciousness to interact with the brain, which we know is at least involved in some way in consciousness? So I think we probably both agree that one has kind of insurmountable problems. My view is, I would say, more on the materialist side. I see even though it's not a solved problem, I don't see any obvious impediment to understanding consciousness from an understanding of how the brain actually works. So I think it would be interesting to explore some of those issues that you see materialism doesn't give, and why something like panpsychism actually answers those.
Yeah. So well, maybe we could kick off with just what I see to be the essential problem with the materialist position that I guess you favour. And so I mean, one thing I press a lot in my book, which is hence the title Galileo's Error, is connected to that, is that I don't think we should be surprised that our conventional scientific approach struggles with consciousness. And that's because it was designed to exclude consciousness. So a key moment in the scientific revolution is Galileo's declaration that mathematics is to be the language of the new science. The new science is to have a purely quantitative vocabulary. So Galileo declares this in 1623, near the beginnings of the scientific revolution. But Galileo understood quite well that you can't capture consciousness in these terms, and that's because consciousness is an essentially qualitative, quality-involving phenomenon. If you just think about, the redness of a red experience, or the smell of coffee, or the taste of mint, you can't capture these kind of qualities in the purely quantitative vocabulary of physical science. And so Galileo said, well, right, what we have to do if we want, science to be mathematical, we have to take consciousness outside of the domain of science, right? He said that's in the soul. He was something of a dualist. That's outside of science. Once we've done that, we can capture everything else in mathematics. So this was the start of mathematical physics. And that has gone incredibly well, and has produced unbelievable technology that's transformed our planet. What we've forgotten is that it was never intended to be a complete account of reality. The whole project was premised on putting consciousness outside of the domain of science. So I think this is crucial, because I think a lot of people, although they accept that this consciousness poses such a huge challenge, as Brian just acknowledged, people think, well, look at how successful science has been. It's explained so much of our universe. We just need to plug away with our standard methods for investigating the brain, and we'll one day crack it. And but I think this is based in a misunderstanding of the history of science. So, yes, physical science has been so successful, but it's been so successful precisely because it was designed to exclude consciousness. So it's gone well because it was focused on an essentially very limited task. So anyway, so I think just to get to the core of the problem, and I just touched on it, the problem Galileo was wrestling with is that you can't capture in consciousness we find these qualities of the blueness of a blue experience, the smell of mint, and you can't capture that, for example, in the purely quantitative vocabulary of neuroscience. So as long as your description of the brain, of what's going on in your head, is framed in the purely quantitative vocabulary of neuroscience, you're always going to leave out these qualities, and hence leave out essentially consciousness itself. So that, to me, is the unsurmountable problem in materialism. And it's a problem, physical science was never in the business of addressing this problem. So that's the core of the issue for me, I think.
All right. Well, I would actually somewhat disagree with that assessment. And I draw and knowing that this problem is actually unsolved, there's going to be a fair amount of guesswork, on either side for this until we can kind of figure things out. And I think we'll lean heavily on various analogies to kind of help get a sense of things. But at least the way physics approaches problems is you will often focus on a restricted sort of description, even though you know that at some scale the vocabulary used might be very different. And so, for example, things like the property of wetness of water, or the property of life versus unlife, things that non-living. These are things that I don't believe Galileo was prepared to handle. Recognize that there are certain complexities, especially with dealing with the sensory experiences, and narrowed the focus on things that were a bit more tangible. But I don't think you would find any scientist now that would say something like the wetness of water is insurmountable in terms of an atomic or molecular description. And we can talk about surface interactions and so on at the detail. But then when you get big enough, those detailed kind of explanations kind of lose their they become too complex to be useful, and so you end up using kind of larger scale vocabulary. The same thing happens with life versus unlife. I mean, you can talk about chemical processes that convert energy into decreasing entropy, and you can look at, and even if we don't know how life started, we can describe. And I don't think anyone would say that life, the description of life, is going to be an insurmountable problem, even though the vocabulary that we've found successful and what it was designed for was not designed for that particular problem. So unless one can demonstrate that it is in fact impossible to describe or produce qualitative descriptions from the purely quantitative, I'm not convinced, at least by analogy, that is actually the case.
Yeah, I mean,
on that point, just for a moment, I was thinking when I read your book and read Brian's response before this show. I was reflecting on my girlfriend's experience when she gave birth. And one of the things, of course, that mothers in labor go through is a lot of pain, right? And even though we're not talking about trying to quantify love, I think we could at least agree in principle that pain is a similar kind of thing. It's something that we describe as very experiential. But one of the things they did with her, every time a medical worker came in the room, was ask her to quantify her pain. And they did it this way. On a scale of 1 to 10, how badly do you hurt? And they'd go further, and they would ask what kind of pain it was. Is it a sharp pain? Is it a burning pain? Is it dull and throbbing, etc.? And so to some extent, that is a kind of quantification. I mean, it's incredibly crude. Yeah. But we do try to quantify these subjective experiences, and we have a certain amount of success with that quantification because we're actually able to convey to people that are entirely outside of our heads largely what we are experiencing.
Yeah, that's a good point, Andrew. So let me be a bit clearer. That I'm not saying that the qualities of experience don't have any kind of structure that we could quantify. I'll give you another example. Colors stand in a kind of similarity space according to saturation, hue, and brightness, and we can map out these dimensions and give a kind of structure there. But I think that kind of structure will always leave something out. It will always leave out, the redness of a red experience. And there's a great article by the color scientist Nut Norby, who is actually, he's a color expert, a really established science, but he has cones missing in his eyes, so he can only see black and white and shades of gray. And he talks about, how he thinks about colors. And he says, I kind of think of them as sort of like sounds, and color, saturation, and lightness is sort of like sound, timbre, and you can get a kind of abstract mapping there. But that kind of abstract mapping will never get you, the redness of the red, or the sound of middle C. And if it did, then a colorblind neuroscientist could read the relevant quantitative description and discover what it's like to see red. And that seems pretty implausible. That's kind of information the qualitative character of the red experience you can only get when you actually have the experience itself. You could never get it just from reading neuroscience. So I think that although we can to some extent map the quantitative structures of experience, the qualities themselves just can't be got at in that kind of vocabulary.
Well, I would say, I mean, that is actually a very interesting case. I had a student who once had that same, cone defect, and only saw in black and white. And it does bring up this question of what it would be like if they suddenly saw color. But I don't see why restricting it to reading neuroscience is the measure that we would use in terms of like understanding a kind of qualitative experience of some kind. Because what you're doing in a qualitative experience is you're taking the kind of external stimulus and passing it through a rather complex biological process, at least kind of all the filtering in terms of what the brain is doing. And it's quite likely that that model is so complicated that you would not be able to describe it in the crude vocabulary of like English. And that would be true whether we're talking about consciousness or some complex interaction of gravitational objects like things with masses. If it's complex enough, we might not be able to give a detailed description without doing a full simulation of the system. And so I feel that to say like there's nothing that he could read and get the understanding of what the qualitative experience would be, it seems unnecessarily narrow in terms of kind of requirements.
So does that mean you're conceding that we can never give a neuroscientific explanation of why red experiences have the qualitative character they do? Are you conceding that?
No. So what I'm saying is that, I'm saying it's possible that that's the case, and so it might help actually if I describe a little bit about the way I see these things, because it's not it's kind of, again, since people don't totally understand the final solution, there's a fair amount of analogies and perhaps things that are not as well defined. But my motivation comes from some of these machine learning models that have been going on for probably about the last 20 years, kind of neural networks, and then more recently all the deep learning, where essentially these systems that are following rules build models of the world so that they are kind of predictive. What we have then is we have a system like the brain that can construct really elaborate models of the world. And it's also tied with all of our motor systems. So it's tied to moving our arms and legs and things like that. And so at a certain level of complexity of model, your brain is going to make a model of the self, and the self is going to be just another model like red, like sounds, like whatever. And so the qualitative experience is simply that model being activated. So we would predict then, even if we don't understand the model entirely, and we might be able to kind of pick it apart in detail later on, or it might be so complex we'd never really be able to practically do that. But we should be able to take someone who has never had color experience and, in theory, artificially create the same model. It may be really hard, because it may be totally impractical, but
you're talking about making them have the color experience.
In a sense, but it's not just, you talk about neural activation, but a lot of the information is also stored in the connections between the neurons, in how many neurons there are, glial cells. I mean, the organization, the architecture, there's all sorts of kind of complexities. It wouldn't just be like activating the right thing, but essentially, yes. I mean, essentially you are activating the self model if you wanted to get that. And you could get people to experience red if they happen to have, enough of the basic model to be able to do it.
But I mean, I think the problem with the disanalogy, so you're just saying it's a matter of, I want to come back to at some point the supposed analogy of life, but just to put a pin on that. But if it was just a matter of complexity, okay, so you're talking about that, there might be certain very, very complicated states of affairs that it's sort of beyond human capacity to understand. But, the point is the information I'm talking about, what we're trying to explain, a child can get it. A child knows what it's like to see red. They know that qualitative character of what it's like to see red.
Sure, of course.
So they've got the, not just that they're having the experience. This is the important point. It's not just, I'm not just saying they have the experience. They have the information, right? They have the information of what, I take that to be a kind of knowledge, a kind of information of what it's like to see red. And so if it's a matter of incredible complexity, what is an analogy to that in another area of science where they get they completely grasp the high level phenomenon, but
So I think a child also understands what it means for a surface to be wet with water. Right?
But we do have explanations of the wetness of water.
Now we do. But when did we actually have a detailed explanation of the wetness of water? And I would say we didn't have it until at least quantum mechanics.
But there wasn't a problem with, right? So look, let's come to this point about the supposed analogy. There's a very important disanalogy between life and wetness and all these other things and consciousness. And the thing is, and to get to the heart of that is that consciousness is unobservable. You can't look inside somebody's head and see their feelings and experiences. We know that consciousness exists not from observation or experiment, but by our immediate awareness of our feelings and experiences, our immediate awareness of these qualities of consciousness. Now, science is used to dealing with unobservables. Fundamental particles, of course, can't be observed. But there's an important difference. In all these other cases, we postulate unobservable things in order to explain what we can observe. Fundamental particles are postulated as part of the standard model that, explains what we can observe. In the case of consciousness, the thing we are trying to explain is unobservable. You can't look at, if you were just going off what you can observe, third person observation, you'd have no grounds for postulating consciousness. You have no grounds postulating feelings, experiences. Daniel Dennett is wonderfully consistent on this, right? So in the case of life, what are we trying to explain? We're trying to explain things we can observe, very complex forms of behavior. And science is good at explaining complex structures, complex forms of behavior that we can observe in terms of simpler things. Ultimately, molecules, cells, fundamental particles. Similarly with wetness, what are we trying to do? We're trying to explain something we can observe, some kind of behavioral, in a broad sense of behavior, some complex structures. We explain it in terms of simpler structures. So we're taking something from third person observation experiment, we're trying to observe it. That is not what you are trying, and physical science has been excellent at that. That is not what you are trying to do in the case of consciousness. You're not starting with this third person thing that you can observe and trying to explain it. We know about it in a very different way. We're trying to explain something we are immediately aware of, these subjective qualities that we can't observe, but that we're immediately aware of. So anyway, let me put that question to you directly. My claim is there's an important disanalogy with any other scientific problem, namely the thing we are trying to explain is unobservable.
I still don't see. First of all, I'm not convinced that they're unobservable entirely. I mean, if we can see, it may be unobservable now given our current technologies. I mean,
think if we get strong enough microscopes, we'll be able to see people's pain?
I think we already can see it in terms of the brain state. This is not merely correlational. I mean, we can. It goes both ways. So we can take something that where someone experiences pain, and we can see patterns in terms of what their brain is doing. And this is again very crude, but we could also elicit those same experiences through electrical stimulation or pharmacology, and get and it goes the other direction.
Why is it not just? It is just correlations because we can't observe consciousness, but what we can do. So let's get specific about what happens in brain science.
Wait, 1 second. You say like we can't observe consciousness. What do you mean by that, actually?
Listen, right, so we can't. What we can do is we can ask people what they're feeling. We can say, what are you feeling now? As the example Andrew, and we can. While we do that, we scan their brains. and we can map correlations. We can discover that a certain type of activity in the hypothalamus is correlated with a feeling of hunger. And so we establish correlations, right? But we do that by relying on people's testimony about an essentially unobservable phenomenon. You can't see the color experience. You rely on their testimony, and then we map correlations. But that is not a theory of consciousness. That is correlation. That is, this kind of brain activity is correlated with this kind of unobservable experience. Ultimately,
would you say,
we want from I'll just finish the sentence. What we want from a theory of consciousness is an explanation. Why are they correlated? So yes, we can correlate them, but we're already going beyond the strict scientific method, because
it's more than just correlations, Philip. The fact that you can drive it in both directions is causal. So the fact that I can create memories by doing certain types of electrostimulation, all right, and I can read people's, I can show them an image and read their brain states and figure out what they're seeing, right? Again, the technology right now is totally crude, but we can tell the difference. Even with something like fMRI, which again is pretty crude anyway, between someone, say, imagining something that's true or something that they actually saw. And to some degree, in some cases, we can go the other direction. We can reproduce those brain states electrochemically and then elicit the same responses.
Yeah.
Brian, you beat me to the punch on part of that, and I want to follow up on one element of what you just went through. You beat me to the punch on it, but you talked about memory just then. And so, Philip, I wonder if you would concede that memory is a set of brain states. And if you do agree that memory is a thing entirely done in the physical structure of the brain, if you would also agree that we cannot have knowledge without memory. And the reason I know the answer to those two things is without the ability to store memories, which is also the ability to have knowledge, then what is consciousness other than those things? So first, do you agree that memory is a function of the brain?
It's a complicated question to ask you to answer, because in a way, I think consciousness is the intrinsic structure of the brain. So look, I mean, there are these tight correlations, and the materialist has one explanation of them, the dualist has another, the panpsychist has another. I think conscious memories are the intrinsic nature of conscious brain states. I mean, we all agree that there are memory experiences are, of course, correlated with certain kinds of brain activity, of course. And we know that if you destroy certain regions of the brain, you're not going to have the same memory experiences. All theories of consciousness agree on that. The dualist agrees on that. The panpsychist agrees on that. The materialist agrees on that. The question is, how do we explain those correlations? These neuroscientific facts are neutral on all the options. The neuroscience, people have this idea that neuroscience favors the materialist option, but David Chalmers, the dualist, he explains those correlations in terms of tight psychophysical laws of nature between the conscious states and the brain activity. That's his explanation of the correlations. So the correlations don't get us anywhere. That's just the start of a theory of consciousness.
Okay. Well, maybe you could tell. So now I'm twice as confused, and it's not hard to confuse me. But I think I do want to understand in your view, and I'm sorry if you're being more of the focus of this thing than you should be. I'm a materialist. So I'm a materialist, and I guess what I want to know now is, and then I'm going to put the mic down and go back on mute. But I don't understand if what you're describing is merely corollary, and I think Brian had a really good point. We can make these things work both directions. We can observe that people have certain kinds of thoughts, and we can create certain kinds of thoughts through pharmacology or through electrical stimulus or whatever. Sorry if I left anything out there, Brian. But what is something that you would consider causal?
Yeah,
I mean, those things are merely corollary.
If you think it's causal, that is not the materialist position. That is the dualist position of David Chalmers, right? David Chalmers says, you've got these close psychophysical laws of nature that relate the brain activity to the conscious experiences. And so he thinks, the brain activity does cause the conscious experiences in virtue of these psychophysical laws of nature. So if the brain activity causes the conscious experiences, then the conscious experiences are something over and above the brain activity, just like my parents caused me, and therefore I'm something extra to my parents. The materialist
I don't know
position.
That we need to
just let me finish the sentence. The materialist position is that they're identical. The brain activity is the conscious experience. So there are these two options. Do you go for the materialist view of identity, or do you go for the dualist view of causation? But these are two. So that the fact that you can see there are these two options shows that the correlations don't settle anything, tight as they are. Sorry, I went on a bit then.
So here's probably where my not being a philosopher might be working against me, because I don't really see much difference between those two, and and it might just be a matter of vocabulary. So let me draw another analogy. If you take something like the property of superconductivity, all right, and this is a property where if you take certain materials and you cool them down to a particular critical temperature, usually very cold, like liquid helium or the newer ones, the liquid nitrogen temperatures, the resistance to electrical current goes to zero. And it's not just it goes really low, it actually literally goes to zero. And it was observed early in the 1900s, and a theory for it didn't come about until around the 1950s or so. Yeah. And up until that time, it seemed like this property of superconductivity was something kind of extra beyond what the kind of properties of solids would be. The fact that it was zero almost kind of came, it's so extreme, it's almost magical in that way. And there were a lot of people trying to explain it. And then the final theory was able to explain it in terms of interaction, a particular type of interaction of pairs of electrons as they're going through, and so you could say that this interaction causes superconductivity, or you could say that this interaction really, maybe you wouldn't say that the interaction is superconductivity, because you're using a different vocabulary for the kind of big scale stuff, but you can explain how it comes about from the small scale interactions, and so you use a different vocabulary. So I'm not sure if materialism is saying that, like, the brain state right now, I take a snapshot, boom, that's consciousness. I don't think that's true at all.
No, that's a great example, Brian, and I think that's my help. I think the right word we're looking for here is constitution, right? The lower level stuff constitutes the superconductivity. Or just let's take the simple example of wetness, right? That H2O molecules don't cause water, right? They constitute water. Like the lump of clay doesn't cause the statue. It constitutes the statue, right? So the materialist view is that the neurophysiological goings on constitute the conscious state. Now, this might sound like a stupid distinction, but it's not, because the dualist David Chalmers thinks it's not constitution, it's a causal relationship between two distinct things. Where you have a causal relationship, you have two distinct things. An example I like to give, I don't know whether this is helpful, think of the relation between people partying and a party. When people are having a good time dancing and drinking, they don't cause the party to come into being and it somehow floats above their heads. They just constitute the party. All it is for there to be a party is for there to be people dancing and drinking and so on. So you see, there are actually these two very different explanations of the correlations neuroscience finds. The materialist says there is a relationship of constitution. The neurophysiological goings on just make up the conscious state, whereas the dualist says, no, it's a causal relationship between two different things. They bring it into being.
Maybe, but again, I think we might be getting hung up on vocabulary. But something like you were talking about water, right? And you're right that two hydrogens and oxygen, like we just label that as water. It's not like it causes water. That's just a label. But the interaction of these molecules with the surface of, say, a metal or something else, that actually causes the wetness. Or wetness is the label we give to that process of that interaction. Just like superconductivity is kind of caused by this interaction of electrons, or we might say that we're describing it in terms of that it's not like it constitutes, it's a process, it's the end of but we're giving a different label because it's on a somewhat different scale. So I mean, I've always understood the kind of materialist approach to consciousness, that the consciousness is the label we give to the result of the process of the brain working. And it works in a particular way with making these models of like the self and of red and of these sorts of things. And then the result is this, what we label as this subjective experience.
Let's try and make it more focused, just talking about the soul, right? Suppose you're a dualist who believes in the soul, but the dualists still think there's a very close, intimate causal relationship between the soul and the brain. Descartes even said, the most famous historical dualist, René Descartes, said, we're not in our bodies as a pilot is in a ship. So there's a close causal relationship between the soul and the brain. Now, then so that the dualist has a completely intelligible explanation for the correlations of neuroscience. So say neuroscience tells us a certain kind of activity in the hypothalamus is always correlated with the feeling of hunger. The substance dualist like Descartes says, fine, that activity in the hypothalamus causes the soul to feel hunger. So that's one explanation. The materialist has another explanation. Neuroscience is just neutral, right? It's just neutral. Now, you might have philosophical objections of dualism that you referred to earlier, but that's not neuroscience. The neuroscience just gives us correlations, and it's then a philosophical question, what explains those correlations?
Well, I would say that, first of all, this continuing talking about correlations is still a little misleading, given that the direction goes in both ways. And I think this is the problem with dualism.
Listen, the important point is there are two... That the neuroscientific data is empirically neutral between materialism and dualism. They can both account. That's a substantive point. The dualist can explain the correlations, the data of neuroscience, as well as the materialist.
Actually, I don't, perhaps, but I would say that you would have to have some kind of interaction. So let's just label this the soul, right? The interacting with the brain in some way, right? You have to have some way for the soul to cause brain states. You also have to have some way for brain states artificially created to influence the soul. You have to have those mechanisms. And the point that I would say is, like, although technically you could probably explain consciousness in that way, it seems like it's just introducing magic. Like, it's introducing another element that there's no way that you could possibly disprove. And so the straight up materialist explanation is simpler in the sense that it doesn't involve these external entities. So actually, I'd be kind of curious to see what kind of with, getting onto panpsychism, because as an alternative, I feel like it's introducing elements that are extra. They're not really needed, or they have to be justified over and above the materialist explanation simply because they're added elements to the problem. So, and I'm not sure how psychism actually solves any of these problems, except for possibly labeling.
Should I say something about panpsychism then? I guess we're talking.
That's right.
Yes. So the starting point of panpsychist is that physical science doesn't actually tell us what matter is. And that seems like a kind of bizarre claim at first. You read physics, as I'm sure you have, right? You read a physics textbook and you seem to learn all these incredible things about the nature of space and time and matter. But what philosophers of science have realized, and there's pretty much consensus on this in philosophy, which is rare in philosophy of science, is that physical science is confined to telling us about the behavior of matter, what it does. Physics tells us, for example, that matter has mass and charge, and these are completely characterized in terms of behavior, things like attraction, repulsion, resistance to acceleration. This is all about what stuff does. Physics tells us absolutely nothing about what philosophers sometimes call the intrinsic nature of matter, what matter is in and of itself. So it turns out there's arguably, this huge, it's kind of independently of consciousness, there's this huge hole in our scientific story, that physical science tells us what stuff does, but it doesn't tell us what it is. And the panpsychist proposal is to put consciousness in that hole. So the idea is there's just matter. This is not dualism, nothing spooky or supernatural, just particles and fields. But matter can be described from two perspectives. Physical science describes it, as it were, from the outside in terms of its behavior. What it does gives us rich information about its behavior. But matter from the inside is constituted of forms of consciousness. So it's a beautifully elegant way of bringing together what science tells us about matter from the outside and what we know about ourselves from the inside, bringing them together in a single, unified picture of reality. And so just to link it back to the discussion we were just having, as I see things, neuroscience gives us correlations between, very, very tight two-way correlations, I agree, between brain activity and consciousness. And then there's the question, what explains those correlations? And there are at least three philosophical theories. One, dualism, that they're different things, but there are special laws of nature that connect them up in very intimate ways. That explains the neuroscience. That's what David Chalmers would say. Two, the materialist view that you can reduce the conscious activity to the brain activity. I think there are all sorts of, I basically think that's philosophically unintelligible when you sort of think it through carefully, because consciousness is unobservable, it's quantitative, and so, well, anyway, we've had that discussion. But the panpsychist explanation is, it, in a way, reduces the brain state to the conscious experience. So the idea, so say we have, let's take a concrete example, say, say this activity in the hypothalamus is correlated with pain. What the panpsychist says is, when you talk about it as activity in the hypothalamus, you're describing it from the outside in terms of what it does, in terms of what its parts do. But the intrinsic nature of that brain state, what it is in itself, is a form of consciousness. So these are two different sides of the same coin, if you like. So it's an alternative.
So what is it?
Yeah, there you go.
What is it in itself?
It's a form of consciousness. So the idea is, there's.
Yeah, it sounds very circular though. You said it's form consciousness, and that's, so I say, what is this thing? And you say it's say it's consciousness. Well, but that's how do you get behind testing when you say there's this explanation? How do I test whether you're right or not?
Okay, good. Well, that's a very common question. Your initial point was circularity. I don't think this is everyone's got to start their theory, take something as basic. As Wittgenstein said, explanations have to end somewhere. The panpsychist says what we have at the fundamental level are forms of consciousness, and what physical science does is describe what those forms of consciousness do. Right. Anyway, but then your question, how can you test this? I don't think you can test any theory of consciousness, because consciousness is unobservable. Daniel Dennett gets this completely right. If you're just going off what if your aim is to explain what we can observe, the data of observation experiment, you would never postulate consciousness, or you'd postulate behavior to explain. You'd postulate mechanisms to explain behavior. You'd never need to postulate feelings or experiences. I think the problem of consciousness starts because, as well as what we know on the basis of observation and experiment, we know something else. We know that there are feelings and experiences. We know that because we're immediately aware of them. And then we've got this puzzle. How do these feelings and experiences that are unobservable, but we know about because we're immediately aware of them, how do they fit together with what we can observe? And panpsychism offers us in my view, the only intelligible and scientifically credible way of bringing those two stories that we know to be real together. That's the justification.
Okay, I want to, like, there are actually two issues here. One is I want to reiterate Andrew's challenge in a sense of, if you can't test it and there's no way to know that it's wrong in any way, then I see it as no different than saying magic did it, or the distinction between terrestrial and celestial matter that used to be all the vogue when Copernicus was around. And it has this sense of, you're postulating a property of matter, or another one that the Catholics like to refer to, the essence of something. And so if you ask them, if you take the host and they say they literally believe it becomes the body and blood of Jesus, and then you ask them, like, okay, if I did a blood test or DNA test, what will happen? And there's like, it'll just come up as bread. But in essence, it has that, but it has no other content, and so it's literally content free. So that's that's kind of one challenge you have there. But the other one, I would say, even more basic, is this idea that science doesn't tell us what matter is, and there I think is, and it might be a limitation of human intellect or not, but what we do is we don't have any direct access to what matter is, and so we are left with lots of indirect ways of dealing with it. So what we do is we propose models that contain components that then we can use to predict behavior of the matter. And then if the models are consistent, then we will often say, well, okay, then the world probably has these components. Now, I would say the physics of the 1900s threw a lot of that under the bus because, one, you have multiple models that are inconsistent with each other in some unobservable ways, but then end up with exactly the correct predictions. So you have those sorts of things going on. And you also have things where it's thoroughly unintuitive, and that can come into play with these models. But in general, that's kind of the access that we happen to have. I don't see it as a massive hole to be filled. It's just really just a limitation currently of the models, and maybe we're left with just an onion essentially of more and more complex models that tell us more and more detailed description of the way the universe is, based on we know it from behavior. So I'm not convinced that there is this big hole to be plugged, and I certainly don't see saying consciousness does it as actually adding anything.
Okay, brilliant. I mean, so the second point, I think you've misunderstood what I was saying, because I'm not saying anything that is at all controversial among philosophers of science. So I mean, but I think I maybe didn't make it clear enough. But let's just start with this point about testability. Yes, right. So I concede. I think you can't test panpsychism, but you can't test materialism either. Materialism. No, let me finish, please. let me get the point. Sure. Materialism, panpsychism, dualism are empirically equivalent. Right, what we can do, you can't observe consciousness, but you can ask people what they're feeling. Their feelings are invisible, but you can ask them, and we have these correlations. And then why do these correlations? The dualist gives one explanation, the materialist gives another explanation, the panpsychist gives another explanation. I've tried to just briefly describe all three of them. You cannot do a test to distinguish between them because consciousness is unobservable. So you can't. All we can do is correlate the brain activity we can observe with the experiences that we can't by asking people what they're feeling. So so none of these theories are, so I think they're all, well, you get the challenge. I think materialism, dualism, and panpsychism are all in the same boat, that you can't, there's no way you can use an experiment to decide between them. How do you decide experimentally between materialism and panpsychism?
Okay, so here's one of the questions is, like, so let's take the way that I was thinking about it in terms of these kind of deep learning models, where they're building models of things like the self and so on, and these are going to have certain mathematical properties in terms of the structure. Like, what do you need to create a model of the self that includes motor and sensory data and so on? What you could take these models and say, what would happen if you raise someone in an all dull black and white room, right? And what would happen if you did this or that, right? You could make predictions about what would happen if you change the environment or change the system, like, what would happen if you change the way the neuroscience works. If you can describe consciousness in terms of these models, then you can make predictions. Once you say something like the soul did it, it's basically God of the gaps.
No, I'm talking about panpsychism. We're talking about panpsychism and materialism.
Yeah,
How do you experimentally distinguish between?
Even panpsychism does the same thing that dualism does. It proposes some what seemingly arbitrary label and untestable and makes.
So is materialism. That's the question. No, but how do we distinguish materialism? But panpsychism, just to be clear, that the it's a radically non-dualistic theory. It's not saying there's the physical properties like mass and charge, and there's these other consciousness properties. The claim is mass and charge are forms of consciousness. Physics tells us how they behave, but they are forms of consciousness.
But what does that mean, really? What does that mean? You say the words, and this is one of the things, maybe that's my, not being a philosopher, I have an issue here, but I literally don't know what you mean by that. And when someone says something is this, I think of like, okay, how do we know? That's the first question that comes up. And it seems like what you're saying is that there's really no way to know.
Well, you're conflating two very different objections there.
Okay.
You started off saying, how do we, what do you mean? That's a question of coherence. And then you're pushing the question again about how do we know? I can address either of those, but coming back to how do we know, the point is all we can know in this area are correlations, and we have to turn to philosophy there are three empirically equivalent options, and so that's we just have to choose between which is the best explanation. In terms of the coherence, it's completely uncontroversial in philosophy of physics that physics is purely structural. If you're familiar with Ramsey sentences, a certain logical tool where you can essentially capture any physical theory in a Ramsey sentence. To put it slightly more intuitively, think of what does physics tell us about an electron? Mass, charge, spin. Mass is defined in terms of gravitational attraction and resistance to acceleration. Charge in terms of attraction and repulsion. Spin is a kind of dispositional property with some analogs to spin at the macro level, but not entirely the same. This is all about behavior. So the panpsychist says, well, what it is that's behaving that way is a form of consciousness. That's the proposal.
Well, okay, so I guess, that's a couple of things. First of all, I would say that when you're talking about the electron, and it may be that we talk about it in terms of this behavior, but what we're doing is we're saying we have a model where an electron has mass. It has the property of mass. It has a property of
what is
charge.
Mass? What is mass?
And then the way that we know that the model is consistent is if it makes predictions about behavior, and that's where we get in terms of like the interactions and the gravitational effects and these sorts of things. And if the model itself was wrong, if for instance it either doesn't have mass, or mass the way we're thinking about it doesn't behave in the same way, or and this comes into like if you say like antimatter, does antimatter have negative mass? Does it have positive mass? It's like, does it make sense to have these things? You kind of push the models in this way, but the models themselves say that these objects have these properties. So I don't even though we might just access them through these observations. And the problem that I'm seeing with panpsychism is it makes no claims about differences in any kind of testable or behavior, and because of that, I don't see it adding any content. You say that consciousness is a fundamental part of the matter. I don't know what that really says.
I think you keep going back and forth two different objections that it's very important to distinguish. One is what is the content of this view? Is it coherent? And then two, how do we know it's true? We really need to separate those two.
Actually, I think those are the same, because I feel like you don't know.
They're not the same. Well, if you listen,
know how it does it.
Yeah, but that's the question of how we know. But the question is, what is the content of the view? Look, people in the 1930s used to be verificationalists who thought, things only have meaning when we can test them. Nobody in philosophy of science is a verificationalist anymore, because the view is straightforwardly self-defeating. I'm not getting this point across, which is completely uncontentious in philosophy of science. I mean, not the panpsychist stuff, but it's not merely how we access. The point is, physics characterizes mass entirely in terms of behavior. Physics tells us nothing about mass beyond what it does. So, I mean, that's pretty uncontentious, but if you disagree with that, what does physics tell us about mass beyond what it does?
Well, let me ask you the question slightly differently.
Can I have an answer to that question though?
Sure. I mean, I would
please.
say that in the when you write down a physics model, you have these properties, and the models themselves just show what the interactions between those properties are, and that's how we would know that those properties are there.
But what is mass? Well, how do we define mass? What is it according to physics?
Well, most of the time, I think physicists go a long way by not defining a bunch of stuff, and they actually just look at the behavior. And I agree with you that practically that perhaps
it's not a matter of practically. Yeah. Ask any philosopher of science, right? How does physics characterize mass? They would tell you it's defined behavioristically. It just tells you what it does. That's nothing to do.
Okay.
I mean, I guess most physicists don't think about it. They just get on with it. But the philosophers of physics will tell you that it's just behavior.
All right, I need to ask a question here.
Sorry.
That's all right. Hold on. Yeah. Let's just take a breath. So I agree that quite often we define things by how they behave. So let me ask you this. How would an electron behave differently if it did have consciousness versus not having consciousness?
So what's the alternative scenario we're supposing that it...
Well, you're saying that consciousness is this thing that electrons have.
So the idea is that mass is a form of... So physics tell electrons have mass, charge, and spin. So
okay, and you're proposing also consciousness.
No. Right. So I still haven't got this clear. That's not the view. The view is not that the electron has mass, spin, and charge and forms of consciousness. The view is the electron just has mass, spin, and charge. That's it. But mass, spin, and charge are forms of consciousness. Physics. No,
I get that. I get that.
Yeah. So when you ask me what would it do if it didn't have consciousness, in terms of the panpsychist worldview, that's like saying that's exactly the same as saying what would it do if it didn't have mass? Well, if it didn't have mass, it would obviously behave very differently.
But what do you gain from a consciousness above and beyond the label of mass, charge, and spin? I guess that's the part where
are we coming back to the question of how we know it's true?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's a question is like, what do you gain in terms of an explanation or anything? I mean, really, or into anything observable or anything. Yeah. What do you mean by tacking on this extra label, consciousness, to these mass, charge, and spin?
It's not an extra label. It's a claim about what mass is. It's not an extra. You can ask the question, what reason do we have to believe that? But it's not merely an extra label. It's a claim about what mass is, a substantive claim.
What if I say that, I'm going to, so the problem is like color and flavor are already used, right? And so
if I say consciousness has mass, charge, and spin, that's a completely coherent concept to you. Well, I'm not saying
no. The electron has mass, charge, and spin. Right, but if the electron is consciousness. No, right. It's not that the electron is consciousness. It's that the electron has forms of consciousness. Like you have conscious experiences. You have very complicated forms of consciousness, and on the panpsychist view, they are the intrinsic nature of your brain states. Your brain states, are just forms of consciousness. Neuroscience tells you what they do and what their parts do, but they are forms of consciousness. Get to the electron. The electron has forms of consciousness. So consciousness is the sort of general property, and it becomes in specific forms, and those forms of consciousness are what physics describes in terms of behavior.
Philip, can I ask you a question? Maybe this will help. Could you get some kind of conscious being with a sophisticated consciousness without a brain? because you have some combination of conscious elements that make up that creature, like, all the molecules and everything else that make it up, they all have consciousness. And so some complex organization of molecules or whatever, but not a brain. Could you imagine a being like that having as sophisticated a consciousness as humans do, such that they would self-report being conscious?
Such that they would self-report being conscious? Or?
Yeah, I mean, just so that we could tell, because obviously we would be able to tell from the inside, we'd be able to tell from the outside, possibly, that these things might be conscious, right? I mean, I could ask the question, like, are dogs conscious or things like that, but they all have brains that are all kind of similar in a sense as humans. But if you're saying that consciousness is a fundamental part of matter, that there's some large collection of matter that you could imagine possibly having as sophisticated a level of consciousness as a human. And that's what I'm asking. Is that something that...
Not as, I mean, not like, I mean, we're not saying these things. I think just talking about experience, which can come in incredibly simple forms. I think, our consciousness is the result of millions of years of natural selection, of very simple forms of consciousness being evolved into very complex forms of consciousness. I'm not thinking like an electron is sitting there feeling existential angst or something. It's just has very almost unimaginably simple forms of experience. Right. Whether something non-organic can be conscious is, I mean, I guess it's an open question. Probably the panpsychist would say the same as the materialist. And I mean, what?
No, actually, I wouldn't say that, because I would say, at least for me, the minimum requirement that I would have to have for something that's conscious is something that's able to construct models of the world in some way. I mean, the brain does that in order to create something like a model of the self. Now, you don't need that. If as a panpsychist, you can say, look, we have a system that all the components are conscious. Somehow there's some combination of conscious elements that give rise to sophisticated consciousness, which we would say for humans. So some combination of our molecules come together, and that combination creates a sophisticated consciousness from the simple consciousness of the individual components. And my question is what sort of systems would you predict would have a sophisticated consciousness, wouldn't have, say, for instance, the model building that I consider to be necessary? That would be an observable difference between the two viewpoints.
But I think it's an open empirical question that, one of the reasons panpsychism is being taken seriously is not just the philosophical resurgence of it, but the integrated information theory of consciousness by the neuroscientist Giulio Tononi, which associates consciousness with integrated information, which is something Tononi gives a mathematically precise definition of. And the hypothesis is consciousness exists at the level at which there's most integrated information. This is, this can account for a lot of the correlations of neuroscience, which regions of the brain are or are not associated with consciousness, which periods of sleep are or are not associated with consciousness. But it also has panpsychist implications, at least to the extent that it implies that consciousness is more widespread than we ordinarily take it to be. But still, I mean, that's just at the level of correlations. And I think you can give a materialist or a panpsychist or a dualist interpretation of what's going on there. So I think it's a question for neuroscience, establishing these correlations and making them systematic, what kind of things are or aren't conscious. At the end of the day, because consciousness is unobservable, neuroscience will just leave us with those correlations between the brain activity we can see and the consciousness we can't. And then, all the philosophical options are still live. And so we keep coming back to this, why be a panpsychist? Why believe panpsychism? I think, it's the only intelligible explanation of those correlations. We need an explanation of them.
Yeah, again, I would suggest that actually, in that sense, for the panpsychist, the answer would not lie in neuroscience, because that's where, we know at least one example, namely humans, where a system seems to have consciousness. We haven't confirmed that really in any other system, really, although there are indications, right, that some of the higher mammals and so on, it does seem like they may be conscious. And in the way that I think of it in terms of building these kind of neural models, I would suggest that it's probably a gray a gradation of sophisticated models from the simplest brains up to the most complex. But I imagine also it might be restricted to something like mammals, which have the extra cortex architecture, which might allow for that. But a panpsychist is not limited to that, right? Because if consciousness is a property of everything, then there should be, unless there's a compelling answer otherwise, some way of combining elements to make a sophisticated consciousness that is not, that it may be non-organic, or maybe organic but not neural, meaning that it's not using brain architecture. And so that comes back to, in terms of it would think that a panpsychist should be able to make some predictions about which systems they think would be conscious, how we might be able to confirm that.
I don't think panpsychism does make any predictions of that. So, I mean, you talk about, we sort of know that we're starting to know some other mammals are conscious. I mean, I don't think we do know that. I think, I mean, how do we establish that? How do we establish whether a mouse is conscious, for example?
Yeah, we ask it, right? No. So
how do you establish whether a bed bug is conscious or
Well, I would say a lot of it has to do with being able to plan for the future, or you can also look at things like the fairness experiments with monkeys. I think it's obviously harder in mice, but I think it's a little easier in chimpanzees to get at least some indications. I'm not saying it's hugely strong evidence, but it does seem like it's at least plausible. But
you're talking about certain kinds of cognitive sophistication, like planning for the future. How do we know they're correlated with experience? How do you know experience can't exist? How do we know those things, that goes together with experience?
Well, because we can train monkeys, you give them different experiences, and they'd have different behavior, right? I mean, you can correlate the brain activities, and you can say you can see the effect of experience. You can test for memories and things like that.
But it seems completely coherent that you could have a creature that can't plan for the future, that can't do anything particularly cognitively sophisticated, but has experience. It has a first person, very simple inner life. Is that not coherent?
I'm not certain whether it is, because I think we're even lacking some of the basic definitional structure, even for what consciousness actually is. It's kind of like talking about life versus non-life, right? Sometimes the vocabulary doesn't quite rise to the occasion, and then you might wind up also with, like, say, for instance, life versus non-life. You get things like viruses, which are like, well, is that life or not? It's kind of gray area, so it may not be entirely well defined. And I'm not sure whether we know, because this is the way it goes with problems that you don't know the answer to. Is that I'm not certain that that consciousness doesn't go down to individual cells, but I don't see any compelling reason to think so. It seems as if consciousness is strongly correlated in two directions with models of the brain that are built up. We can understand how those models are built by building artificial systems that are like that, and we can see similar systems in chimpanzees and other higher mammals. So to me, that's like, again, it's not ironclad proof, but it seems reasonable anyway. I don't see what panpsychism adds to that.
I don't think some people put it this way, we don't know what consciousness is. That's the mystery. I don't think that is a mystery at all. I think we know quite well what consciousness is. Nothing is more obvious than your, feelings and experiences. So I think, we know what we're talking about. The mystery is, how it fits together with the other things science tells. I think this is why it's so different to any other scientific phenomenon, that in every other case maybe I'm repeating myself here. I think in every other case we're explaining stuff that we can observe, complicated material things in terms of little things. But the starting point for consciousness is I'm immediately aware of my own feelings. And so we have this special way of knowing about consciousness that we don't have about life. Or we know about life because we see it, and we explain what we can observe, and science is good at that. We know about wetness because we can see it, and we explain. But we know about consciousness and the phenomenon itself in this utterly unique epistemological way. We're immediately aware of it, and we're immediately aware with these qualities. And what we want an explanation of is these subjective qualities we're immediately aware of. Science has, as Galileo appreciates, science has never been in the business of science is in the business of creating mathematical models to describe the behavior of matter. It's not in the business of trying to explain unobservable subjective qualities that that we know about, not through observation but through our immediate awareness of them. So it's a very different project to the kind of project science has been so successful with, I think. But that's, yeah.
Can I just jump on and do a time check? Are we all good for time? And sorry, what I should have said first was I'm loving this. My silence is absolute, what's the word, an endorsement of the conversation that's going on.
I'm loving it too. Sorry if I'm sounding a bit. I hope I'm not sounding aggressive. I'm just getting.
You're clearly passionate, Philip.
Getting into the discussion. I'm really enjoying this.
That's fun.
I've done a lot of podcasts recently, but I guess not so many podcast debates. It's nice to have a debate. It's good. Yeah.
Well, I think the conversation's been great so far. So I don't know what everyone else's time constraints are. I will run up on a time constraint in the not too distant future because my girlfriend will come and say, "You have not done your part with the child."
Right.
But we're in a good place, and I can go for a little while longer depending on what everyone else's constraints are. So.
I should probably head off in a few minutes. Actually, maybe we should wrap things up a bit. Not much as I'm enjoying it.
Yeah, I do admit that this is the consciousness has a unique perspective, in the sense that our interface to it is unique, because it's if you take it as the product of brain states and our brain is kind of attached to our body, it makes sense that our interface to this particular phenomena is a little bit different than other ones, and so that's why it has this kind of special status. But I don't see that from a physical system to be really any different, other than the level of complexity.
But the reason it's different is that defines the datum we're trying to explain. In the other cases, what we're trying to explain is what we can observe third personally. But in the case of consciousness, what we're trying to explain is not known in that way. The thing we're trying to explain is known about in a very different way, and so that's why I think it's quite unique. But maybe that's the same point you.
It is, but can I ask this question? And this is maybe a larger question than it seems. But what do you consider to be the goal of an explanation? So how do you know when you've given what you would call an explanation, as opposed to you've simply labeled something? Like, for example, we see a gravitational effect in galaxies, and we don't know where that extra mass is coming from, so we label it dark matter. It's not an explanation; it's simply a label, almost a placeholder for, like, we'll figure this out later. But it's kind of labeling a particular observation or phenomena, or whatever. What do you see as a difference? What you mean by an explanation, and how does panpsychism actually satisfy that?
It's about. I think the goal is to find the simplest theory of reality that can accommodate all the phenomena we know to be real. So I guess a lot of people think, so what are the things we know to be real? A lot of people think it's just the data of observation experiment. So if we've got a simple theory that can explain all the data of observation experiment, job done. I think there's something else we know to be real, namely our feelings and experiences. So that's another datum our theory of reality needs to explain. So what I'm essentially saying, it's a more expansive conception of science, but it's essentially doing what science does. Science tries to get the simplest theory of reality consistent with the data. I just think there's, as it were, a non-empirical datum. There's a data over and above what you know from observation experiment, namely the reality of feelings and experiences. But it's the same project that science does. It's just the simplest theory that can account for all the data.
Okay, but when I come back to it doesn't seem like that has any content, because you have no idea how to tell whether it's correct or not. In terms of, like, in the two examples I gave, is saying, like, magic did it, or so kind of like the idea of celestial matter or whatever. I mean, where you kind of give this label to something that's non-testable, and you just say, well, that's the explanation for consciousness. I mean, I would just say, like, it's magic that happens, and there's no, and it interacts with brain states and things like that. But it's pretty much consistent with any possible observation I could possibly make, and by being essentially infinitely flexible in that way. It doesn't really add anything.
I think what you keep doing, there's a clash of methodology. You keep coming back to this thought that the task of a scientific theory is to account for data of observation and experiments, and that's what a theory does. But I'm saying, well, no, that's not the aim of science. The aim of science is to get the simplest theory that can account for both the data of observation and experiments and the reality of consciousness. So, I mean, look, in any even with empirical data, there's always an infinite number of theories compatible with the data. Mm-hmm. We just go for the simplest one. So, we just have to. We know that consciousness exists. We know through neuroscience it has these intimate relations to brains. We just have to look at the different theories, find the simplest one, and that's our best guess. That's the case for it, really. I think, materialism is one explanation, dualism is another, panpsychism is another. I think panpsychism offers the best explanation because I think materialism is philosophically incoherent and dualism is, problematic in the ways we've both discussed.
Right. Yeah, I don't think I'll be able to add much to that, because I think we are probably, running into kind of our idea almost of like, what is truth, what is truth and things like that.
Yeah.
I'm definitely an empiricist in this one, and I would say that consciousness is just one more type of observation. I mean, albeit it has certain special status because we're seeing it somewhat internally in a way, but to me it's just another kind of a type of observation, and thus it should be amenable to the same sorts of empirical approaches as has been successful in the past.
But I don't think this is saying going around in circles. I mean, the difference between us is whether you think materialism is coherent. I sometimes put it, actually, it's like, I can't remember the Sherlock Holmes line, once you've ruled out the improbable, what remains, no matter how improbable. Sorry, once you've ruled out the impossible, what remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. I think materialism is demonstrably incoherent. And given that, I think panpsychism is, the better option. But of course, that's what it comes down to, right? It's really a disagreement over whether materialism is coherent.
Sure, and I think in some places, I think your view of materialism is overly narrow and doesn't. And I think it came out a little bit when we're talking about the result of the brain functioning versus identical to the brain functioning. And I think that, some of the perhaps, and this might have to do with kind of philosophy and having to define certain terms, but I think some of the views you've expressed seem to indicate a more narrow, almost not quite straw man view of what materialism is. And I would also add, although I did really enjoy the parts about time travel in your book, I felt the same kind of thing happening there, where there are models of time travel which fall outside of the examples that you seem to think were exclusive and exhaustive. And so if that's the case, if it turns out that narrowly thinking materialism is incoherent, but there is essentially a consistent materialist definition that is not quite so narrow, then that might solve some of it. And that might be just like kind of lack of imagination on all of our parts in terms of coming up with what the model should be.
I think that was probably just miscommunication. I mean, what I was trying to say, I think there's a difference between constitution and causation, and maybe, identity is perhaps a way of gesturing to that. But I've spent 15 years looking at the detailed theories of consciousness that the materialists offer, and maybe that was just a failure in miscommunication. I mean, what it comes down to is the principle. I think physical science is mathematical, quantitative, has been for the last 500 years, whereas this phenomenon we access from the first person is quality involving. And I just think that's a radically different kind of vocabulary, just a different kind of concept. It's colors and smells and these characters of experience is very different to the causal, mathematical, quantitative. So that, I mean, that's, the knowledge argument pushes that further. But I think that's the principal difference. And then I think we're going through a phase of history where people are so blown away by incredible success at physical science that they're led to think, oh, this is everything. This is the complete story. And I think that leads to a nice sense of security. And, people talk about religion being a crutch. But I think, this idea, oh, no, we know where the answers are now. And, we don't have them all yet, but we know. But, I think the irony is, I think that the reason it's been so successful is because it was focused, on a specific task, giving quantitative models to predict the behavior of matter. But that's not what, explaining consciousness is trying to do. It's trying to explain these qualities that we apprehend. It's not about explaining macro level behavior. So it's just a different task. And
maybe I should. I'd like to ask Brian a question. I was reading an article put out by IOP. I think it was over on Physics World, and the article was talking about the way people behave in crisis. And so we're talking about large groups of people when there's a fire or an earthquake or a flood or something like that. And apparently we act in large groups somewhat like gases act in constrained situations. And it seems to me that whatever consciousness is, if it was something that caused us to behave in a way that physical systems don't act, it seems to me that consciousness would be a thing that would emerge, that when we were able to analyze people statistically as a large group, right? As you've got a stadium on fire or whatever. It seems to me like consciousness would express itself in some place like that, where maybe we would get, some behavior that didn't look like other physical systems. And I wonder what you think about that, and if you're familiar with those kinds of that kind of analysis.
I'm not completely familiar with it, but I have heard of it. I would be a little wary about interpreting systems of humans in extreme situations, because it's kind of like, if you put your hand on a hot stove and you didn't think it was going to be hot, like you immediately pull back, right? It's totally unconscious. And so there's certain behaviors that people have that are not at all tied with their conscious thought. And my guess would be that in the case of like a fire, you're going to kick in all the essentially pain reflexes, but the fight, the kind of the flight reflexes, and that consciousness really would be downplayed in those sorts of cases, because it becomes less necessary for survival. You just want to get out of there, right? And so you're going to behave more like just, you're going to bump into randomly to a bunch of people. You're going to behave more like a gas in that sense. Consciousness happens in a sense when you have to plan out things. It's interesting to talk about like learning a musical instrument. When you first learn it, you're conscious of every single motion of their fingers, say on the piano keys. After you learn it for a while, it's like they call it, say, quote, muscle memory, but it's really just like, memory of where your finger should go. Your model of the music system is such that you don't need to invoke the model of the self in order to play music anymore. And these sorts of things are entirely consistent, I think, with thinking about consciousness as the result of brain states without invoking any other external elements such as souls, or by positing any other properties of matter. And so that's where, I think it can be constructive from a scientific point of view to study consciousness, is those sorts of situations where you can kind of see where it's useful, where it's not. Is there a way to test it? And it could be I'm wrong about these things, but it's how we know whether we're right that I think it becomes important.
Guys, this is fascinating, really enjoyable, but I'm going to have to make a move, I think.
All right.
Okay, did you want a couple of minutes to give a wrap up and thoughts, Philip, or have you literally run out of time?
I don't know. Well, I'll probably just end up repeating myself. Or do you? I think I've probably repeated myself quite a bit already. But
me too, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think we've laid out the two sides, and it's really nice to debate. I should do it more often. It's fun. and thanks so much, Brian, for taking the time to write that response to my work. That was really interesting, and I really appreciate you taking the time to do that.
Oh, thank you. This has actually been a great learning experience for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes,
Brilliant.
thank you both. Genuinely appreciate this. Thank you.
Oh, well, thanks for the invitation, Matthew and Andrew, as well.
Thank you, Matthew.
Philip, it was, I really enjoyed the conversation. Maybe this time even more than the previous times we've been on mic together. This has been.
It was more fiery this time.
Well, I think that's.
I've just broken my trousers.
I think that's worth. I think there's some real value in that, right? I mean, there's some passion about this subject, and I think the truth is we're all passionate about what it means to recognize the I of me, right? What does it mean for me to be me? And so thank you for being willing to come back and to a newly branded show. So it'll be Proscenium going forward, because we wanted to branch out from religion and do more of this kind of thing. Put religion behind entirely, but this was a conversation largely devoid of religious content, except for the dualist bit, which isn't necessarily tied to one religion or another. So, at any rate, thank you very much for the conversation.
Thanks, guys.
Right, thank you. Have a
Stay
good
in
night.
touch. Take care. You too.
Cheers. Thank you, Philip.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye-bye. Brian, do you have any closing thoughts?
Well, I mean, I would hate to say anything, given that Philip is not here to defend it.
Right.
That seems a little unfair.
Yeah, and we don't want to stack the deck unfairly. That's
right.
not.
I was actually curious what Matthew's favorite time travel movie was. I'm not sure whether you want to give it away at the end of this episode or force them to read the book. But
Sorry, my favorite
time travel movie.
Oh, Time Crimes.
I don't know that one.
It's the one that he makes very brief reference to in the chapter on materialism. It's a Spanish movie. It's a foreign language movie about a gentleman who's it's a very low budget movie, and I highly recommend it. I'd say it's called Time Crimes. It's foreign language with English subtitles. Okay. I don't believe there's an English dubbed version, but you should always watch it in the original with subtitles anyway, is my opinion.
Yeah, I see that.
And I won't give you any spoilers because I highly recommend the movie, but what's great about it it's a linear time travel story. So the guy, the main character in the film, sees an instant right up in the opening scenes of the film. And as the film progresses, he comes back to that scene, and you realize that scene is part of the time travel moment that he's witnessed. So it's all a coherent single strand, not like Back to the Future, where when he goes back to the future to fix the car in the second movie, the scene is actually different to how it was in the first movie, and you've got different threads. It doesn't mess up time travel like that.
Right. Well, the Terminator is one which is also consistent, where you see where it's kind of circular, except for there's always some element in these movies where the circularity is a little funny. So, like, I think in Terminator, there's a watch, if I'm thinking about it right, that's given to the character who then brings it into the future, or given to the kid who then grows up and then ends up giving it back, right? And then the question is, like, who made the watch in the first place, right?
Yes,
it's in this loop, but it's kind of in this infinite loop right now. And so there's usually something like that, even in those movies that are kind of consistent. There's some object or other that kind of is kind of within the loop. And I seem to remember a Star Trek episode that was like that, where I think they found Data's head in like some mine,
one of those caverns. Yeah, that's right.
Caverns, and then they bring it back up to the Enterprise, and then later on, like, Data gets like blown up and his head gets lost, and so they put the head they found back on Data, and everything's good, and they leave the other head basically in the past.
Right.
So it's like, okay,
maybe it's the
he
same
ends up
head.
with his 500-year-old positronic head. That's right.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
well, I challenge you to watch Time Crimes and come up with and find a part of it which where they've tripped up like that. But yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts on it. I love it. It's a great movie.
Was it subtitled, or what language did the actors?
It was English subtitled.
It was English subtitled. Gotcha.
Yes. That's that. There was a thought that I had, and I take on board what you said about talking without Philip being here to defend himself. And I wanted to put this forward, but you guys were having such a great conversation. So I'll ask you if you would classify this as a suitable, not necessarily experiment or thought experiment, in terms of separating materialism from other ideas, and that is, if we fiddle with the physical structure of the brain, either chemically or physically by removing bits, we fundamentally change the experience of consciousness in that individual during that moment. Is that a good enough experiment to take to separate materialism from panpsychism or other ideas, or would we need a rudimentarily better experiment than that?
Well, let me comment actually on something that that Philip would agree with, and so I would consider that to be evidence against dualism, for example, because there's not a good way to propose how the soul interacts with the body such that it's two-way. And so a lot of times when people talk about correlations, they're saying, okay, like I observe these brain states and I observe this behavior and they happen at the same time, or small delay or whatever. But the experiments are generally two-way, which is where you can modify the brain and elicit that same behavior. And so there, like for instance with dualism, I had always thought that was insurmountable. Although I think Philip kept saying that empirically all three models are equivalent, that you can explain the kind of empirical facts with all three models. I'm not sure. And there, I think you probably have to ask Philip what, he seemed to say that that panpsychism was untestable. So there wouldn't be something that you could do to the brain and observe behavior such that you would be able to demonstrate panpsychism is correct or not. And so that seemed to come up a number of times in the discussion.
Okay. Has your materialism been challenged at all in the conversation, Brian?
Not really. I mean, I kind of, like I said, I'm still confused a bit as to what content is added, and some of this might be just vocabulary differences. I mean, I'm not a philosopher, and so I don't phrase things in that way. I get the sense, and I was perhaps not able to wrap my brain around it, but that the label of consciousness was being used almost as just a label, like this extra thing, but it didn't actually serve any function in terms of the explanation. You can say all you want that consciousness is like the intrinsic nature of it, but I feel like it has the same content that, as I said, like the divine matter or that kind of thing, where it's not testable in any observable way, but somehow is still true. And I think I'm at heart an empiricist, so I'm probably resistant to anything that's not demonstrable in that way, mostly because I've never seen anything that I would count as true or that was not demonstrated empirically. So I guess that's and maybe that's my own personal hang up, but that's at least the way that I approach things.
I landed largely in the same place over the issue of correlation versus causation. If brain states are merely highly corollary, what does causation mean in the panpsychic view? Is everything that we observe, is it merely corollary when you're doing fMRIs or other kinds of medical imagery, right? If all of that is corollary, what is causation in the physical world, in the panpsychic view? And I'm not. Yeah. I know that this needs to be. I don't either. But that was where I sort of hit a wall, because I think I'm probably an empiricist too.
Yeah. Well, at least in my experience, when scientists talk about correlations, they generally are talking about one way. They're saying, like, we measured this, we measured A, we measured B, they went up at the same time, they went down at the same time, they're correlated, right? But then they do experiments to try to see if they're causal. So what they do is if you can actively change A and then
Right.
produce B as enough, then you know that there's some causal link there. Now there might be other things in between. There might be like A is actually
There can be
causing C, which
complexity
is
there.
causing B, whatever, and then and so on. But there's like but if the correlations in a sense go both ways, then we have this kind of like where meaning that we can observe the correlations, but then we can change one side actively and get the other side to change. That's a causal link. Now, sometimes it can happen both ways. Like if you take climate change, for example, like increase in temperature can cause increases in CO2. Increases in CO2 can cause increases in temperature. So you can see. And so if someone says in the past the carbon dioxide followed temperature, meaning the temperature went up, and so carbon dioxide went up and then went down, and then they say, because I've heard this from some of the climate science deniers, who then say something like, therefore carbon dioxide does not cause temperature increase, or it's not it's not a causal thing. But in fact, the causal direction is actually theirs in both cases. You can wiggle each toggle, and they each affect each other because it's a feedback loop.
Right.
But in the case of dualism, the biggest problem that dualism has is that there's no proposed mechanism for that interaction happening in that way. And so it was kind of news to me that Philip said that the dualist model can explain this tight, what he called tight correlation, which I would suggest is strong evidence of causation with the brain states. I'd never heard of a dualist being able to really explain that, but maybe David Chalmers does or not. But I don't know.
I don't know.
And but that's so I in all of this I think very empirically, but I should probably be going as well. I should get home.
Brian, thank you for coming back and joining us. It was a really
thank you, Brian.
Good conversation.
Oh, it was great fun to have, and thank you very much for inviting me again.
Well, you're welcome.
It was great, and
hopefully
there'll be another one as well at some point. We'll work that out.
Excellent. Good luck on your new podcast.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
It. We'll communicate offline going forward.
Very good.
All right, fellas. Thank you.
All right. Cheers, Brian.
Cheers.
You have been listening to a podcast from Reason Press. Do you have any thoughts on what you've just heard? Do you have a topic that you would like us to cover? Please send all feedback to reasonpress@gmail.com. You might even appear on an episode. Our theme music was written for us by Holly. To hear more of her music, see the links in our show notes.